This is video 2 titled Winnie, Madikizela and Nelson Mandela's Mutual Heroic Love. Furthermore, the apartheid regime was relentless in its onslaught on Winnie. Madiba would learn about their activities against her from newspaper clippings that sympathetic warders have anonymously placed on his bed. Visits of loved ones to prisoners were times in their lives which they knew were momentarily, but wished they could last longer, much longer than the limited time allocated for visits. Prisoners wanted to make the most of these moments and dreaded the prison warder's call. The time was up. For all the years that I was in prison, I never failed to be surprised when the warder called, "Time up." Winnie and I were both hustled from our chairs, and we waved a quick farewell. Madiba recounted these events in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. I always felt like lingering after Winnie left, just to retain the sense of her presence. But I would not let the warders see my emotion. As I walked back to the cell, I reviewed in my head what we had talked about. Over the next days, weeks and months, I would return to that one visit again and again. I knew I would not be able to see my wife again for at least 6 months. As it turned out, Winnie was not able to visit me for another 2 years, Madiba recollected. There was nothing I found so agonizing in prison as the thought that Winnie was in prison too. I put a brave face on the situation, but inwardly I was deeply disturbed and worried. Nothing tested my inner equilibrium as much as the time that Winnie was in solitary confinement. In a letter to Winnie written from Robben Island, Madiba highlighted the emotional hurt inflicted by apartheid against him and his family. Physical suffering is nothing compared to the trampling down of those tender bonds of affection that form the basis of the institution of marriage and the family that unite man and wife. Madiba highlighted the abnormality of being deprived by the apartheid regime to live a normal family life, which is the cornerstone of a civilized society. It has not been easy for me during the past period to separate myself from my wife and children, to say goodbye to the good old days when at the end of a strenuous day at an office, I could look forward to joining my family at the dinner table, and instead to take up the life of a man hunted continuously by the police. Living separated from those who are closest to me in my own country, facing continually the hazards of detection and of arrest. This has been infinitely more difficult than serving a prison sentence. No man in his right senses would voluntarily choose such a life in preference to the one normal family social life which exists in every civilized community. The family as an institution was dreadfully impaired by apartheid and its systemic racism against the black majority like no other societal formation. Madiba puts the focus on how the apartheid system targeted the African family, inflicting long-term consequences. It takes great emotional intelligence and stoic self-regulation to be deprived of touching your wife for over 2 decades. But when Madiba met Winnie at Paulsmoor Prison in 1984, it would be the first time since his imprisonment that he would be allowed by prison authorities to touch his wife Winnie. This was not a right or privilege afforded to him when he was on Robben Island as a Qaitini. He always had to meet family members at arm's length and without having the emotional opportunity to touch them. Madiba described the occasion when the prison official, Warrant Officer Gregory, escorted Winnie to the room where he met her. But Gregory escorted her around the door, and before either of us knew it, we were in the same room and in each other's arms. I kissed her and held her, my wife, for the first time in all these many years. It was as if I was still dreaming. I held her to me for what seemed like an eternity. We were still and silent, except for the sound of our hearts. I did not want to let go of her at all, but I broke free and embraced my daughter and then took her child onto my lap. It had been 21 years since I had even touched my wife's hand. Mandela lovingly said, Winnie and Madiba's marital love was put on trial. Their marriage was subjected to constant state security surveillance and harassment for close to 3 decades. Madiba, the freedom fighter, was romantic in his own special way as defined by him. I would hope that the average individual experiences one of the highest levels of emotional attachments, satisfaction, and happiness when in love. Imaginably, the words of the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning sums up their love in her poem, and that intimate moment when Madiba and Winnie met and lovingly touched one another that day in Paulsmoor Prison. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem reads as follows: How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight. For the ends of being an ideal grace, I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use, in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose. With my lost saints, I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem is breathtaking. Explicably, love is an emotion expressed and reiterated through a couple's tender and loving touch. Marital love without the couple being able to touch for such a long time was a punishment which inflicted enormous pain, anguish, hurt on Winnie, Nelson, and their family. Words cannot do justice to convey and grasp the extent of the emotional wounds inflicted on the Mandela family, Winnie and Nelson. But such was the depth of the emotional intelligence of Winnie and Madiba and also of all freedom fighters imprisoned for their political beliefs, as well as their families separated from them for such a long time. Their triumph of the human spirit outlived their pain and anguish. Their sacrifices are like the sweetness in the nectar that the bees seek to make their honey. A beehive which would keep on giving to a liberated South Africa for generations to follow. It is significant to mention Winnie as one of the role models from whose life as a freedom fighter much could be learned. Instructively, her life as a freedom fighter has much to teach us, no less than that of Madiba, other ANC leaders, and liberation struggle icons from other South African political formations. Her spirit of resistance, fortitude, courage, grit, and selfless sacrifice deprived her of a normal family life as imposed on her by the apartheid regime. The apartheid regime targeted her and tried to make her life as difficult as possible. It was part of the apartheid regime's tactics that an injury to her would also be an injury to the oppressed people and Madiba whilst he was in prison. Her gallant role and life lessons as a freedom fighter must not be relegated to the margins of history. Her contribution deserved more than a mere historical footnote mentioned in our monumental liberation struggle. Considerably, Winnie put the love of the oppressed people above her own interests. She selflessly gave of herself to the extent that it hurt her and her family. But she was motivated by a higher cause. She devoted her entire life with love and sacrifice for the greater good of our liberation struggle. But even her mistakes, if such are the obsession of her unsympathetic critics, offer us deep insights and perspectives into the lives of those who lived in the tidal wave of man's inhumanity to man, as systematically inflicted on her. We all are fallible. We all have our mistakes. But we will inflict a historical injustice on Winnie to single her out for her mistakes, rather than her exemplary and outstanding contribution to our liberation struggle and our freedom. Speaking about those who write history and whose judgment on the lives of great people, which would determine ultimately how posterity remembers them, Madiba put it in perspective when he said, "It is also a fate of leadership to be misunderstood. For historians, academics, writers, and journalists to reflect great lives according to their own subjective canon. This is all the more evident in a country where the interpreters have a much greater pool of resources to publish views regarding the quest for dignity and nationhood. This reminds us of the African proverb that says, 'Until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be the hero.'" Inspiringly, these verses from the poem by African-American author Maya Angelou sums up Winnie Mandela's characteristics as a freedom fighter, seeking to liberate South Africa from colonialism and apartheid.
Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise.
Winnie Madikizela Mandela did rise to the call to liberate South Africa.